something like 1984 could actually happen. This is the direction the world is going in at the present time. If you want a picture of the future, imagine a boot stamping on a human face forever.
Let him who hath understanding calculate the number of the beast. For the number is that of a man, and the number is 666.
Sheep among wolves.
All right, we are back here and we have gone through all of the awakenings and we are now up to the current period. And before we get into that, I want to kind of explain a theory that has been rumbling around my head and what I've kind of come up with here. And this is the understanding of major cycles. And the first one is this 500-year cycle, which we kind of touched on, which is that 72-year cycle of man with a 10-year war cycle. But what you have then is you have basically 7 of the 72-year cycles with 10. So it's basically 500 to 580 years. And that would be a major empire cycle. And we see that in the first century from Christ, which is for about 500 years, you had this Roman Empire, and then that went away, and then another period of 500 years came into existence until around the 1000, where you had the Crusades, and that created this whole Muslim versus Christian period that you had, or what you would call the Dark Ages. And that kind of came out of existence in the 1500s when you had the Protestant Revolution. And then, of course, you had the moving of Europe across the world, primarily through the East and West India Company, where you had the merchants, the British merchants would go out into the world. And that started what the period we are under now, which then, of course, America was formed under that. And we are now coming to the end of that cycle. Well, in the midst of that, there's also a 1,000-year cycle, which in ancient times, if you use 1,000, it really means a heavenly or a religious-oriented cycle. And we see that in Revelation where they talk about the 1,000-year reign. Well, that's a heavenly reign. That's a reign of a spiritual, as opposed to an empire of man. And we see that in 1,000, where you had the split between the Roman Church, the Catholic Church, and then you had the Greek Orthodox. And they split around 1,000, and that started a new cycle. And then you have a broader cycle beyond that, which is this 2,000-year cycle, which correlates to a really big cycle, which is about 26,000, and which is the zodiac cycle. And I understand people, when you say zodiac, I'm not talking about astrology here. I'm talking about astronomy. Mm-hmm. And that is where our solar system, our sun, moves through these constellations, because the zodiac is really just constellations in the sky. And our sun moves through that over a 26,000-year cycle. And what we had back in when Christ was born was a new cycle beginning, and that was where it was moving into the Pisces cycle, which is part of the reason why Christians are, part of the fish, is because Christ in astrotheology was associated with Pisces. He was, a sign in the constellation because our sun was moving through Pisces. And what we have now, 2,000 years later, is we're beginning to move out of Pisces into Aquarius. And so that's even a broader sense. So this period of 2020 is really a culmination of all these coming together. A 500-year cycle, a 1,000-year cycle, a 2,000-year cycle, and even possibly a 26,000-year cycle, which could be the new heaven and new earth, possibly, or it could be in the next cycle. We don't know. Nobody knows the day or the hour. That's why I believe this time period right now is this time that John was talking about in Revelation. I want to kind of get your take on that, because again, you come from it a little bit different than I do. I come from it, from this direction, but you and I pretty much come to the same conclusion, just from two different directions.
Yes.
So what's your understanding of that?
It pretty well fits with a lot of what I believe and what I've studied. The fact that this is all coming to a head is playing itself out in the current events that we see. There's so many of these things that are coming together that 50 years ago, when we talked about it, I was just beginning to see all that, and you had to have real faith to believe that some of these things could really happen. And yet here we are, and it's happening. We talk about the 1,000 years. We had mentioned about the last time that it was counterfeit, the 1,000 years. Primarily, we've heard of it, especially our generation, my generation, that Hitler wanted to have the Fourth Reich of 1,000 years. And there are indications that there are people that are still trying to have that 1,000 year, but it is a counterfeit of the 1,000-year reign of Christ. As you know, I've come at it more from the literal, the actual 1,000 years that we'll probably have. But you mentioned something to me when we were talking tonight, really resonated with me. And that is that we're talking about the Great Reset versus the Great Awakening. And of course, we're talking about the spiritual forces of God and Christ and the angels and against the principalities and the powers and Satan. And these two are coming together. And we're seeing a lot of those results. But one thing you said was that this Great Reset is really just a renaming of what we've talked about for basically all your life. I've talked about it since the 60s.
Yeah, it's a rebranding of the New World Order.
Yeah, the rebranding of the New World Order. And what in the world is a New World Order? You've heard all that terminology. We heard that when President Bush talked about it in the year 2000. And basically, it's a coming
No, it was
together.
his father, actually.
Yeah,
it was earlier. It was his father.
That was his father. Yeah, it was the first Bush. But there's really three parts. You're going to see a merging of countries into a one world government. That means, and we'll talk about this more in depth, but that basically means that one government will have control over the whole world. You'll have to do what they say, or you won't live. And there will be a one world economy. And that means that the economic systems will be tied together completely. And they have been trying to do this. They call it globalization. And we saw a breaking of that off over the last 4 years with President Trump. And now, if things go the way it looks like they're going to, that's going to be pulled back together. They're already talking about undoing everything that President Trump did to break that apart and make it a nationalism and bring it back to a globalism. And that's a one world economy under one economic system. And the third component of this is a one world religion. And we already see that right now, most of the religions of the world are cooperating quite nicely, except the one thorn on their side, which is called Christianity.
Well, parts of Christianity, because under the new Pope, Catholicism is definitely moving toward that direction.
Yeah, definitely moving toward that. He's already publicly stated that several times.
He's a Jesuit, so
yes.
He has been a Jesuit from South America, and he's big into liberation theology. And he has been pushing this global world order, especially in religion, because he's actually reaching out to the Muslim world and trying to connect the two. So it's some of the other religion or other Christian denominations and faith communities that are pushing against this globalism.
Yes, and we'll see that tension continue until it's no longer strong enough to fight against what's coming, which is a one world system. And as I say, it makes up of the three major parts: religion, economic, and government. And this Great Reset is basically, as you say, a rebranding of that. That just goes into a little bit more detail, and it's more open as to what they're attempting to do. And I believe we can go through some of those parts. But we see this from both a spiritual and from the fact that you and I have been in business for all these years, and both both working and of course teaching, and it's academia.
Well, the first thing is we want to introduce a lot of what we're going to talk about here over the next time as we move forward here. You can get this on the World Economic Forum or Council, their website. They're very open about this. And that is what we would call Davos, the Davos group.
Mm-hmm.
And that is a group of basically elites, world leaders, the top CEOs of all the major corporations, media, everything, public policy. They all meet together once a year, actually a couple times a year, but they have a big meeting once a year. And it's kind of under the umbrella of the World Economic Forum, or the WEF. And if you actually go online right now, a lot of what we're going to talk about here in the next few minutes, and you'll see that online. And it's pretty impressive, actually. If you go online, they have it's almost like a wheel of, I think it's like 300 different areas. You talk about detail.
Right.
This is one of the most detailed pieces of literature I've seen. I mean, they have really thought of every single line item, piece that you can think of in our world. This is not just loosely put together. They have been working on this for years, if not decades,
Right.
maybe even a century.
And basically, what if you go and look at that, you'll see that they're into almost every facet of an individual's right, because they really don't believe in the individual. They believe in the collective group.
Yeah, it's all collective.
Yes, which is diametrically opposed to what the United States was founded on and has been belief system up until this point. And so when you look at that and you see the depth of the entry into all facets of a society's life, the life cycle of society. It's it's really, like you say, it's impressive. But again,
No.
spiritually, we're fighting against principalities and powers, and we know that even Michael the archangel didn't want to. He wanted to have help. So we're battling some pretty heavy stuff here, and if it is the way that you and I believe, it's going to get worse. It's not going to get better. If you are an individual and you believe in individual rights, and if you believe in God, if you believe in Jesus Christ as our Savior, then you're going to run up into some pretty heavy flack before too awful long.
No, the key there is individualism, although they couch it in the word nationalism. And you can definitely see that in the media now, where if they say nationalism, it's usually with a negative connotation, because they believe that individual countries do not have rights, because the world is a collective. The people are a collective, and we all have a stakehold in every country's resources and how they operate. And that's what they're moving us to. And like I said, this site, if you get a chance, really just go into this site, and you can spend hours going in, because they have an interactive, like I said, it's an interactive wheel where you can go on each line item, and they have this every single country, every single different area that they want to focus on. And they have all these. What's key here is each one of these areas has a organization tied to it. So, I mean, we're talking about thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people that are involved in this, and organizations are tied to just one little section. It's almost like what you had in the military, which is, each area, and it's a sub area of a sub area of a sub area, and you don't necessarily know what's going on or the whole picture, except in this particular case, they've given you the whole picture. And then they've broken down all the little subgroups to go, underneath that. And one of the main areas that they want to get rid of is capitalism. They don't believe, they will tell you they believe in capitalism, but it's different than what you and I understand capitalism, as far as free flow of resources in an economy, a free system. They talk about capitalism in a way which is, they have this understanding of a private public relationship, and the bottom line profit isn't really the main reason for a company. It's just, it's just one of the things that if you happen to have a profit, that's fine. If not, it really doesn't matter. Mm-hmm. And that's different than what you and I really understand as capitalism. We really need to take note that they will throw out words, and it'll sound like, they still believe in capitalism, but it's really not what you and I think of when it comes to capitalism. So what's your understanding here of their wanting to have this public-private partnership? What is your understanding of that?
Well, what you have, if you think about how businesses in our country operate on a normal basis, you have companies that are what are called public companies, and that simply means that they sell their ownership to a great number of people, and if they're big enough, strong enough, have the ability, they go on to one of the stock exchanges, and then their stock is traded. Typically, the majority of them are owned by institutions. And this is where people put all of their 401ks, all of their investments. It's the majority of the middle class in this country have invested in the public companies. We're talking about Apple, we're talking about Walmart, we're talking about Costco, talking about Pizza Hut. We go down the list and just name all of these different businesses that we all utilize. And that money is given to the companies and then, or to investors, investment companies. And those investment companies then invest in the different companies that are operating. Now, that's good. However, the problem now that we're seeing is that they're become so large that we have one investment firm, I won't name the name of it right now, but they have $7.5 trillion of funds that are invested into thousands of businesses. And they are all in with this new reset, with this new stakeholder capitalism. And what they're telling the companies is that we own sometimes 20%, sometimes 30 or 40%, 10%. We own enough of your company that you need to listen to what we tell you. And so the managers of the company are told, you will invest in diversity, you will invest in climate change, you will invest in whatever we tell you. Does it sound familiar? Whatever, you will disinvest in the things that they're pushing now is fossil fuels, the normal, going toward the green things, which over the last 12 years have proven they don't work that well. But that's irrelevant because profit is not what they're looking for. So
No, profit is not the bottom line.
Yeah, they're not worried
that's not the main goal. If it's a shareholder base, then obviously profit is the main goal. But this is not shareholder base. It is stakeholder, which is different than shareholder.
That's right. And the problem that we have in this society right now is that millions upon millions upon millions of everyday people have invested their 401ks and their annuities into these companies, which now the managers are not listening to them. They're listening to the people that have institutions who have invested in them, and they will do what they say, not what you want with your money. And you have no say in it. So you're a shareholder, but you're not a stakeholder.
Yeah, it's much like what you saw when we had the collapse of 2008, and you had, what was that, GM, the bondholders?
Yeah.
It has for 200 years. It was sacred in our well, that goes back to British law.
Yes.
That bondholders, they're above everybody else. They're even above shareholders. And under the Obama administration, when that collapsed, the bondholders didn't get their money back. In fact, it went elsewhere. Any of that money went elsewhere. And that was the start of this breakup of, it really doesn't matter what your stake in the company is as far as shareholder basis or bondholder basis. It's the stakeholders, i.e. the government or government type entities.
Yeah. And the managers. Now remember, the individual management of these companies cave in, or they're kicked off the board of directors or whatever role they're playing in management. They no longer have a job if they don't, because the large institutions control them. And we've seen this progression, you and I have. If you think all the way back to when a savings and loan was your personal banker, they catered to this middle class. They catered to individual shake of a hand, I'll be there with you even if you struggle. And the savings and loan were basically collapsed so that the banks would first control them and then eliminate them because they were for the small business, for the small persons, for mortgage on your building that you're selling shoes or whatever. And that moved into the banks. And you and I saw firsthand on the mortgage industry. The mortgage industry did loans for small residential. They were there, the personal one. They were independent, and through the Frank Dodd Act.
It was even before that. It was Sarbanes-Oxley.
Well, that's true. Even before that, it was collapsing, and so you had a consolidation again. And then you had the banks and the financial institutions went from 10% of all the deposits in this country to 75%, 80%. They collapsed that. We even have seen it in the CPA industry, where the small CPA firm has been basically squeezed out. And now you have basically all the large CPA firms handling all the large companies, which have squeezed out the smaller businesses. And now, with this COVID-19, all the small businesses across this country are being squeezed out. And you see who falls by the wayside. If you own a small dress shop, you can't have people come in, except in a few states. But Walmart can sell dresses.
Well, it goes beyond that. You got the restaurants.
You got the restaurant.
I mean, they're completely destroying the restaurant or the live entertainment industry.
Yeah.
A lot of these bars and restaurants are not going to survive unless they're a major chain. Oh. And that's the whole goal. I mean, you're seeing that in a lot of this consolidation, especially, I just went out for Christmas shopping, and I mean, these major chains are going to survive because they have a lot of investment behind them. And also they have access into programs, from the government or private institutions that will, give them money. But what you see in these malls now, or these, these big chains, but a lot of the smaller ones that we would see in these malls, they're gone.
Yep.
They didn't survive through this COVID because they didn't have the capital behind them to survive. And so we are now just moving to just major chains and big corporations that are running our retail, and then, actually every major industry, not just retail.
Correct. And this was purposely done. We know that they have been consolidating every facet of every business in this country to eliminate the individualism. Because if you work for just a big company, you will do what you're told or you're fired. You have no control. There's no entrepreneurship. It's being destroyed. But a central government cannot control a lot of small businesses and a lot of individual people. They have to have it all consolidated where there's only a few. And they've been doing this for a long, long time. It's just that now it's accelerated. And now it's like a snowball. And now we're reaching that point, like what we've talked about, that, hey, folks, it's real, it's here. What choices are you going to make? And as I say, we're very quickly consolidating the globalism for the economy, which you and I see very clearly. They're globalizing the governments so that they will be under control of regions. And then there won't be individual countries because individual countries speak their own mind. And you can't have that if you're going to have a central government. And the same with religion.
Yeah, and go back to the government, the consolidation of the regions, and they really have. They got three major regions that they want to divide up into, and then they have sub-regions underneath that. You have a North American region, you have a European region, and you have an Asian region. Those are your three main hubs. And in the North American, obviously, it's Canada, Mexico, and the United States. But then South America will also be kind of brought up into that, for the North American. But that's really what they want. They don't want this, America has their own thing. Germany has its own thing. Turkey has its own thing. China has its own thing. No, they want these, much like what we see in the European Union, where they have these unelected bureaucrats that are controlling what is going on in each of the individual countries. And the people no longer have a say in what their country is doing. And so what does that mean for the United States? That means, we could have a constitution, but it really has no meaning if we're under a global system. It's a nice piece of paper, of something that we used to have, but under the new system, we will be under a governance of an unelected bureaucrat, maybe even not even from the United States, that is telling people in the United States what they can and can't do. And they have this detailed system in place of hierarchy, and it just trickles down into all these little sub organizations. It's highly detailed and organized. This is going to be thrusted on us so fast, we won't even know what to do. And all of a sudden, we're just going to wake up and some organization is going to be telling us you have to do this. And there's nothing we can do because our governors or our president or any elected official is going to say, no, that's what you have to do. And if you don't, here's the police officer to take you off into jail. And that's what's coming.
Yes, there's no question.
There's no question that is coming. And there's not a lot we can do because it's here. And the World Economic Forum, their January 21st is when they're meeting again. And the title of their conference is The Great Reset, how they want to now start the ball rolling. And by 2030, that's their goal. So what is that, 9 years? They want an entire world under this global system. And one of the areas that they want would be, for instance, you will own nothing and you will like it. You'll own no property. In fact, you won't even own a wristwatch. You'll rent it. That's what they believe is a utopia, is that you just rent things. You'll no longer own anything. You won't own property. You'll just rent it. And I don't know about you, but I don't think that's I don't personally like that. I enjoy having my house, and I enjoy, having things that I own that I know somebody can't take, my bed. I don't want to rent a bed. And that's really what they're talking about.
Scary as to what's coming, but we know what's coming if we just listen. It's I'm just remembering back. This is not something that just suddenly came upon us. It must have been 15 years probably ago that my wife and I went to Europe for about 6 weeks, and I was stationed in West Berlin, so we went back to there, and we have family ancestry from back there, so we went to Berlin. And touring around with a gentleman that was riding a bicycle. He had a master's degree in economics, by the way, and he couldn't find a job. And this is all he could do is have a bicycle with us sitting in the back, having
Yeah.
almost like a buggy wagon propelled by a bicycle. And he's pointing out all these buildings that they're building. And he says, half the city is empty, and they continue to build government buildings
In anticipation.
in anticipation. And here we are 10, 15 years later, and down the road here, they'll fill them because they'll need a lot of people to put their policies into play. And you're right, that's they don't like individuals. So you will do as you're told. And as you said, one of the things is the free rent. They will institute government care, health care. We went through all of this when Obama first took office, that they wanted to put Obamacare in, and that was
Well, the goal of Obamacare was to get universal care. I mean, it was written in the law that way.
That's right.
And it was sidetracked because Trump came into office and they changed it. I mean, they didn't get rid of it, but the whole goal was that basically by the 2020s, around now, that healthcare would be so expensive that people would, force the government to say, hey, we need to have something, and that would be the universal care. And that's how they were going to implement it.
Right.
It just didn't work the way they wanted it to work.
Well, it was put on hold for a time. And so now it'll come back off the back burner.
Yeah. And that's why the mandate was in there, is that everybody had to do it. And then they were going to raise the rates every single year to the point where people couldn't afford it. And they would demand that we would have universal health care.
Right. Right.
And you had brought up a point about this, government buildings. And the point I want to bring up here is this understanding that, folks, this has been in the works for decades. This isn't just something they thought of overnight. This is something that has been planned in detail and has been implemented over decades. And I would go beyond, 40, 50 years even in some areas.
Easily.
Yeah. And so we're not going to defeat it by, unfortunately, just electing somebody and, now, of course, they'll defeat it. No, this has been embedded in our system and you're not going to get it out. I mean, every facet of our government system, our federal bureaucracy, and state bureaucracy, and local bureaucracies, by the way, have all been moving toward this for decades. And that's not going to get weeded out overnight. This, whether we like it or not, at least some, if not all of this will be implemented, whether we like it or not.
Yeah, and we've said all along, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. Can it be stopped for a period of time? Of course it can. God is capable of anything, and God could intervene, and we could see a slowdown of that. Or God doesn't intervene, and the last country on the face of the planet that truly has freedom and has truly been built on the foundation of God's principles is soon to go under the control of those that don't have the same belief. And they call it a post-Christian society. And our country really has been operating under a post-Christian society for quite a while now. And so we're seeing the government posing, getting tighter and tighter, more and more central. We talked a little bit about the economic systems that are getting in the United States that are getting more and more central. And we've seen the religious side get more and more central. We saw the rise we talked about before, the mega churches, and people gravitating to those. And now those mega churches, with one fell swoop, are basically disappearing because of COVID-19, and they don't assemble like they did. People are just kind of fading away because they relied on those big churches, and that's not going to happen anymore.
Yeah, and like I said, it is my hot button. So I like anytime you bring up the church, I throw a little rants in. And part of that is this idea of the program. You know, you walk into church and everything's choreographed, and you walk out of church. There's not really much interaction that you have other than that, as opposed to, you know, church prior to the 80s, 90s, where you had these smaller churches. And not to say, I mean, obviously I go to a large church, and so I'm not dinging on large churches. You know, obviously the first century church was a large church, but the idea of this community, and when you take away the focus of, you know, you being engaged in the church life and with other believers, and you change your focus to, I walk into a service, you know, I watch a show, you know, I may clap and sing and hear a great sermon and then walk out and there's not much there. Well, what happens in a COVID-19 situation where, you know, now all of a sudden you have to watch it on TV? You know, are you more apt to get up and watch it on TV? I mean, okay. It's like watching, you know, a Netflix show.
Yeah.
You know, now you're watching, you know, a service or whatever. Whereas if you were a community-based church, I mean, those are your people. You want to interact. It's like interacting with family. You want to interact with them. You know, you feel a connection with them. And that's going to be the difference going forward, is what type of church are you? Are you a, for lack of a better word, a service-oriented church, as in the sense of program or service, not service in the sense of to your community? Or are you a community-based church with the people? And now moving into this great reset, we are going to have to connect with people. If our connection with the church is through a service, you know, or watching TV, it's not going to sustain us when some of this harder stuff hits. Whereas if we're a community-based church and some of this stuff hits, we can, you know, we can rely on other Christians in our community to get through this and to support us. And that's where I feel like some of these mega churches have done a disservice to the community of believers, because the focus is not on a community, it's on the show or the pastor.
Yep.
Sorry, that's just my rant. We can move on. That was just a rant.
Well, no, actually, you and I have talked for many years about the above ground and underground church that people thought I was crazy way back when, that there'd come a time when the only way you could worship the Lord is through individual homes or through private worship with individuals, as opposed to the churches that have submitted to the government. I think of Germany. I'll tell you, when I visited the Dachau concentration camp, I was stationed in not only Berlin, but I was stationed in Munich also. And outside of Munich was the camp Dachau. And to see the gas ovens, and it makes it very real. But during the 30s, when Hitler began to take power. And they first started with the physically retarded children, and they began to have them disappear and eliminated. People didn't say anything. They thought, well, it's mentally retarded. Maybe we just don't need them. And then they moved on to, or physical, then they moved on to the mentally retarded. They moved on to homosexuals. Then they went to the Polish. They shouldn't be around. All of those people disappeared. Then the Jews, people are more aware of the Jews, but there were a lot of other groups besides.
Yeah, prior to the Jews.
Prior to the Jews, absolutely. Dachau actually was formed for the political dissidents. That was what it was originally formed, as a political concentration camp. And then they moved others into it, and then eventually it was primarily Jews. But then they killed the Jews. We all know about the final solution, which is appalling beyond comprehension. And the church, throughout each one of those steps, did nothing other than a few pastors, because the churches had been taken over by the government. And the churches were mouthpieces of the government, or they didn't fit in. They didn't get their social credits. That they didn't define it that way at that time, but that's what it was. They didn't squeal on people that violated the law. And all of a sudden, they started eliminating Christians. And the Christians said, well, wait a minute, why are you doing this to us? And they couldn't stop it. It was too late.
Yeah, it's Kiplinger's poem that he had.
Yeah.
At first they came for the Jews, then they came for the Catholics, and then finally they came for you.
Yeah.
If you don't stand up for any of those groups, ultimately they will eventually get to you.
Yes.
Whatever group you are, because you're not part of the top. You're not part of the elite. And ultimately, if they eliminated everybody else, even part of the elite would start to be eliminated.
Well, yes.
Because again, it has to do with power. It has nothing to do with anything other than power. And it's evil. It's chaos. It's evil. And evil, an evil person will do anything in its power to get ultimate power. And so they will continue until they receive that ultimate power. And then they'll find something else to go off of. I mean, it's just how evil works. And yeah, I mean, you brought up the story about Dachau and then how the Germans really didn't fight back. I mean, there's stories, where these trains would go by in these communities.
Yes.
And they would be, going on with life like it's normal. Literally this concentration camp is miles from where they are. They did, it's like dissidents. They just, out of sight, out of mind. We're just not going to think about that.
Well, actually, in Dachau, when President Eisenhower, he was General Eisenhower at the time, came and saw what it was. Now, Dachau was actually a small town, a village, yes, whatever you want to call it. And so he got them in because the smell went for miles.
I can't imagine the people would not know.
They made the troops, the American troops, made the mayor and every single person in authority and all the people of that village to march around the Dachau and see what it was actually there, so they could not deny that it was there. To see the gas rooms and the furnaces right next to the room where they would put the person in the room, drop gas, because you could see the like
Yeah, the chimneys.
system, and they'd think it'd be a shower, and they would put the gas down on them, and then they would bring them out of that room and throw them into the big ovens, big brick ovens right outside. Now, if that doesn't reach your spirit, then
You're evil.
Yeah,
I'm sorry, you're evil. If that, I mean, if you just think, oh, well, that's just normal, then I'm sorry, you have an evil spirit.
And that's,
how could you not look at that and say it's evil?
Dachau was not one of their large camps. It was just one of their first ones. And so that's what
Auschwitz, was that the big one?
Yeah.
Well, and understand too, I mean, we talk about the German concentration camps, but the reality is the Russians had more concentration camps literally over the border. I mean, they were next to each other on the borders, not far from each other. And honestly, the Russians killed more Jews and Christians and dissidents than the Germans did.
They have
and what is population. And what is the, between the two, what's the similarity? Both of them one was a National Socialist Party and the other one was a Communist Party. But they're both part of the same system.
Yeah, they were both totalitarian systems.
Yes.
And that's what, when we talk about the one world government, the one world economy, and the one world religion, it will be a totalitarian system, counterfeit to the system that Christ will set up when he comes back to reign for the 1,000 years. Now, if that's 1,000 or however many years that is, but he will come back to reign, and this is the counterfeit that's coming. That's what people need to understand, that we are now on the threshold of what's coming. Now, how long that will take, not sure. It can go rapidly. What was you were telling me about? Which country was that within 2 years it fell?
Poland.
It was
a democracy, and within 2 years it was communism.
Yeah. And that's what we're looking forward to.
Because the system's already in place. Again, they didn't just raid the country and all of a sudden 2 years later. No, they had been for years, if not decades, infiltrating at the core points in the government so that when this point in history they came, they capitalized on it.
Mm-hmm.
And they've done the same thing here in the United States, where they have key people in power at what they call choke points in our system. And whenever they're ready to implement, they will choke out that portion, and literally overnight, we'll have a new system.
Yeah. Well, I remember back when Khrushchev said, we don't need to come and send ships and all of that. We'll destroy you from within. And here we are.
Oh, when the saints go marching in. Oh, when the saints go marching